you all for joining this session. It's the succession panel discussion, and we have three awesome speakers today. My name is Joanny Yang. I will be moderating this panel discussion. So, if you have any questions for our speakers, feel free to put it in the chat box, and we'll make sure that we address it at the end. In this panel discussion, you're going to learn the importance of developing a succession plan, and our panelists will share their vast experience on how they have incorporated succession planning into their personal careers. And for those of you that heard, maybe even in your personal lives, if you have kids. And so, first off, we have Roy. Roy, if you can just wave your hand. Roy is a retired CIA senior intelligence officer who has served as a digital SME in the foreign field. She currently serves as the director of talent acquisition for Excellence Technologies. Then our second speaker is Jeanette. Jeanette is a managing director in PwC's advisory practice, who co-leads the PwC's national security regulatory compliance practice, and she focused more on the export controls and sanitations. She also leads a team of subject matter specialists in assisting the multinational and US-based companies in understanding and managing compliant risks relating to export control, anti-boycott compliance, and so forth. And our last but not least, we have Roy. Roy has 35 years of experience in both the public and private sector as a talent acquisition expert, a human resource manager, and diversity and inclusion program manager. Roy is currently serving as a senior manager at talent acquisition for Navy Federal Credit Union.
That's actually Ron.
Ron, sorry, Ron. Yes,
I know Roy and Ron.
I know. I purposely put them apart, and then I still. So I apologize. All right.
He's the nice one.
Yeah, that's good. So our first question for our panelists, and we'll just go in order of responses. We'll start with Roy, Jeanette, and then Ron. So if you guys can just please share your vast and diverse experience on how you have either developed or managed a successful succession plan.
Well, I started scouting from day one. So at the CIA, you serve at the pace of the mission. And some things that are going around the world are like this. So what may be important today isn't as important as it was tomorrow. And I'll give you an example. When I first onboarded, everything was about China and Russia. And boy, when 9/11 happened, all of a sudden we had to pivot to counterterrorism. So always be selling your position, because you never know who's listening, right? And it could be the people to your left or right, and also within your organization. I also suggest that you check for bias in your succession planning. What does your mission actually need today? Because it may not be what you need it tomorrow. I know the CIA had to revamp everything. What type of skills are you actually looking for? Your leadership. Director Brennan, I was his deputy chief for diversity leadership study. In fact, I worked with Ron down there, and it was a study that took a hard look at our what we were doing right and wrong at the agency. And a lot of that came down to succession planning. And Director Brennan looked at his senior staff, and everybody looked like him, basically. They were white, male from the East Coast, basically with the same type of background. And then he took a step further, and he looked down into who are his emerging leaders. And guess what? It was mostly the same. So he knew that for the CIA to be the premier intelligence agency, we had to reflect everybody in the United States, right? And we had to bring different prisms to look at those key operational areas. And with that was the succession planning on that. So it has to be intentional when you're looking for bias in your succession planning. And then always be grooming those who are working with you, just not within your team, like, your deputy, but also those that parallel your team or across your team, because those are actually very good people that could succeed you or to be partners in the future.
Thank you, Roy. How about Jeanette?
Thanks, and thanks so much for the introduction. So before joining PricewaterhouseCoopers, I spent 31 years in government across 7 different agencies. So I've held a lot of different positions. Most of them, I was either a startup of one, where I was tasked to start an office, or I inherited an office in distress, or otherwise had to pivot because of a reorganization or some other external force, much like what Roy mentioned about 9/11. Part of that involved living and working in China for 13 years. And as Joanne mentioned, I now co-lead a consulting practice. All of the big four accounting firms have built-in succession planning through a system of mandatory retirements. I'm not subject to that requirement per se, but I do believe that it is always important for the health of any organization to be very deliberate in making pathways for future leaders and to set them up for success. We went through an exercise not dissimilar to what Roy described at the agency, where we looked at the upcoming pipeline for managing directors and partners and said, wow, this needs to reflect America. We need to grow greater diversity of background, of gender, of thought, of ethnicity, and we need to plan for that across all levels with a goal of 50% of our partnership being diverse candidates within a certain period of time. And we make that public through a transparency report so that we hold ourselves accountable. So I think having some ability to be accountable for how you're thinking about succession planning is one way to make sure that you stay on track.
Thank you. And then we have Ron.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you all for dialing in today. We really appreciate you joining us for this conversation. Like my colleagues, I did spend a full career in the government. I worked with CIA for 31 years and retired from there. And rather than focus on that time, I appreciate Mike's comments earlier about the not-for-profit piece. Let me focus a little bit about succession planning and my at least experience with succession planning in not-for-profits. Following my career at the agency, I joined 3 companies, well, really 4 companies. 2 of them were not-for-profit. One of them was Capital One, and then there was also a government contractor. So I worked for 2 not-for-profits and 2 very much for-profit organizations. And as you would expect, the succession planning in each of those organizations was very different. It was very unique. It was very tailored to both the culture of those organizations and the skill sets that were inherent in those organizations to meet those respective missions. And I understand many of you are trying to do succession planning for your particular chapters. And I think a lot of the concepts that we're going to be talking about today will definitely apply to those. One interesting thing that I drew from the not-for-profits was many not-for-profits have a very limited pool of talent that they attract. And that's inherent for a lot of reasons, right? Where you are in the country, what the skill sets that you're recruiting for that you need, how you reward them. Many not-for-profits either don't pay very well, or they have a very limited scope of benefits or scope of duty. So many people just want to join not-for-profits, or even in an organization like this, they want to participate for a while, then they want to go do something else. They want to leverage what they did here. That makes succession planning very difficult because it's hard to gauge the longevity of the talent, the mix of the talent, and who you can pick from to grow and develop that talent is sometimes very sporadic. So you do have to employ, I think, some unique approaches in the not-for-profit that maybe you don't have to use in a larger organization. In particular, I think you really have to have honest conversations. You have to have the ability to assess the talent fairly and accurately. And I like what Roy said about trying to work out bias. That's critical. And I'm going to talk more about when we get to some of the other questions about some of the bias that I've seen and how you can maybe not only look for that, but how you can honestly deal with that so that it'll attract talent so you can build on that succession plan. So I'll stop there as we move on to the other questions.
Thank you. So we have our next question. Before I get into that, just for the attendees, if you can just put it in the chat box if you currently have a succession plan or you're working on one. Because the next question is, when did you decide you needed a succession plan? And what was one major challenge in developing a succession plan?
So just like getting on an airplane, I am always looking for the exits. No joke. Because I have literally been in an assignment at the agency for like 110 days and then moved over when there was something, a pivotal piece that needed to be addressed and moved over. So again, as soon as I'm even considering a position, I'm already thinking, okay, who could succeed me? Who could be my deputy? What key members will I need to round out this team? So to me, it's an ever evolving thing that I'm always constantly thinking about. When I was moved, in the 108 days, I took on to be the chief of digital hiring for innovation. So that's all of your cyber and data scientists. And that was a huge undertaking. It was the only time in my entire career that I basically got to pick most of my entire team out, and that never has happened to me at the agency. So of course, I really had to step back and think, what do I actually need to round me out? And believe me, I have a lot of potholes on how I manage, so I needed somebody to share in that. But then also, I knew that I was retiring in 18 months. I had to start grooming as soon as I walked in the door of who could replace me. And then also, who are those key players of, if I put Ron or I put Jeanette in these key assignments, who are the players that they're going to be working with? When are those assignments up? Because I don't know if the rest of you, at the CIA, you're only in your position max 2 to 3 years, right? So you're going to have to rotate out, and that keeps it keeps all the balls in the air all the time. And at any point, new administration, something goes wrong in the world, you're going to have to step up and really have to have a deep and wide bench to cover that experience in order to be successful.
Thank you. How about you, Jeanette?
So the Foreign Service is quite similar, right? In that you have a defined tour of duty, 2 or 3 years long, you move on. And this is more common now with the private sector as well. So I knew when accepting any new role that even in that acceptance process, as you think about what are my first 100 days going to look like, you're also thinking, what do my last 30 days look like, right? You're always in that mode. Just like Roy says, you're always looking for those exit signs. If you don't have an off ramp, you can't plan the next on ramp. And it's really important that you don't lose sight of that. Like Ron, I've also been very active in the nonprofit world. I serve on the board for the DC chapter of Ascent and have for a number of years. This is where I met Michael Mao. And we have a lot of turnover. It's very natural. So when you think about how do you plan for change, whether it's in a nonprofit or volunteer-driven organization, it's a little different. In some ways, it's a much more self-selecting population that you have to draw on. And you have to think about how do you grow that next generation of leadership, perhaps a little bit differently, because some opportunities may be more organic, whereas others somewhat less so. And certainly in my current capacity at PwC, I've always had a very, very young team with a lot of natural turnover. So it's important to constantly be thinking about how do you reinvent, and you think about how do you build better, how do you build smarter. So in that vein, when I think about challenges to succession planning, I think the biggest one is linear thinking. It's really easy to think about endless growth. I have 20% year-on-year profitability growth or whatever. This is infinitely sustainable. I just need to keep chugging along. Next year will be 50% growth and so on. But sometimes that's not what good growth looks like. Sometimes, whether you're talking personally, professionally, organizationally, individually, it's not just about being bigger, right? And for nonprofits in particular, I think it's really important to keep doing a values check. Are these goals that you're setting reflective of the core values of your organization? And how are you going to know that? Don't just assume success because you've got big numbers.
Thank you, Jeanette. And then we have Ron.
Well, there's really not a whole lot to add to both of those comments. Those are very spot on from my experience. I will drill down just to the basic part of the question, which is, when did you decide you needed a succession plan? I guess I'd phrase the answer like this. And I see in some of the chats, some of you are saying you don't have succession plans. You don't need a succession plan in an organization. You can throw what happens now and what happens next totally to the wind, totally to luck, totally to the hope that when you move on, that somebody qualified or somebody is dedicated or somebody is willing to commit follows behind you. So if you're willing to do it without by luck, and if you're willing to do it by chance, do not invest in a succession plan, because your life will be much easier. If you're not willing to really risk it, and you really want to have some stable, maybe predictable process about how talent will come and go, and how the organization's mission and your goals will continue to evolve, then you definitely need a succession plan. And I think ultimately one of the other challenges that come with a succession plan is your and the leadership's ability to assess talent. It's very easy to say, that person over there can follow behind me because they think just like me, or they act like me, or they approach problems like me, or they side with me with every issue or with every decision. They see it the way I see it. There's my successor. You could do that, but what an awfully bad way to assess talent, right? You really have to assess talent based on what is the mission of the organization, whether it's a chapter, whether it's a company, whether it's a mission or a task force. And then you have to assess what is the skill set that's needed, the wide range of skill set. So I think, as Jeanette's saying, it's not just leadership, but every piece of the mission, what skills are needed to meet that mission. And then when that piece leaves, what skill set's going to be needed to meet the mission then? And the mission will evolve, so those skills are going to change. So how are you constantly assessing the people that you're going to be tapping into for the succession plan? And then accurately assessing those skills, right? Putting aside bias, putting aside favoritism, most importantly, putting aside anger and disagreement and annoyance and all the things that really defined Mike Mao and my relationship, putting all that aside and still trying to pick the right person for that job. Mike was not the annoying one. So ultimately, I think how you assess the talent, how you then approach a talent and groom that talent to step in. And you might only have a day or a week or a couple weeks to do that. Or you might have the blessing of to do it for months or maybe even a year or longer. But ideally, it's a constant process.
Thank you, Ron. And so before I move on to the next question, just want to ask the attendees, do you know where your exit is? And if you don't, do you have a person that can take you to the exit? So feel free to use the chat box, either yes, I have an exit, or yes, I have somebody, or I don't know where I'm going and I'm here to figure out where. All right, so the next question, we have two more. So this is second to the last one. So if we have figured out our exit, or we figured out the person to take us to the exit, how do we know, or how do we measure that the development or the succession plan was successful?
Now, of course, you could use stats, but stats are one thing. I do it kind of by feel. I know a succession plan has been successful is, do people want to be part of that team, right? If you've put a great leader there, they're going to naturally, people will migrate to them and they will want to go the distance with them. And our officers departing from that team, like in mass, within the first 90, 120 days. And the people that remain and on the team or, in these pivotal positions, are they going on to bigger assignments, promotions? Are they taking that role on to mentor and to groom and to build their own personal bench? I mean, that's also imperative. But I do caution one thing. Once somebody is on the bench, and I think Ron and Jeanette both hit on it, once they're on the bench and they've taken that risk to take on some of those big assignments, and maybe they failed a little bit, right? This is where they get coaching. But I don't think, unless it's just like blatantly, it just wasn't a good fit, I think forgiveness is also important, that you give everybody on the bench an equal share to also make mistakes, right? This is where you can also measure someone's growth, because I've made a lot of them. I've probably learned more from my mistakes than my successes, right? So your bench isn't made of perfect people, right? It's an ever evolving talent pool that you're always building to, again, deep and wide.
Thank you. And then Jeanette.
Thank you. So I echo everything that Roger said. I completely agree. I would also say that we have a process in my group where after every major project, we sit down and do what's called a hot wash, where we look at what worked well and what do we need to take another look at, analyze so that we can do better. It's a continuous improvement process. When it comes to succession planning, I think taking what Roy said, another step in a different direction maybe would be to ask, are you uncomfortable? Are you feeling apprehensive? Maybe even a little bit scared? If so, keep going. Because succession planning, by its very nature, is meant to be an exercise in moving goalposts.
I could not echo that thought anymore. And I guess I was approaching this question from two different perspectives. One was, how do you know a succession plan for an organization is working? And then how do you know a succession plan for you individually is working? And for the individual part, one of the key attributes that I said that you need to look for is that you're increasing in fear, that the more responsibility you take, the bigger risk you take in growing your career, there's actually a part of you that's scared to death about that. Am I going to succeed? Am I going to embarrass the people that are my mentors or my sponsors? Will I embarrass my family or friends or my boss even? Those are realistic fears. And in some ways, that's a good sign. If it's coming from because you're growing, that's a good fear. If it's coming from lack of confidence, or I don't have a good network, or I don't feel like I'm a good influential person, then it's coming from a different place. And I think you probably have other issues that you're going to need to work on. From an organization perspective, I think a succession plan tends to work if it's fair, if it's equitable, if it's transparent to the people that are part of that succession plan, meaning they can look in and maybe they don't agree, but they at least understand how decisions are made and why Roy was moved into that opportunity or why Jeanette wasn't, even though she was the heir apparent. So that's the transparency part. I think if it also grooms people for increased responsibility, that the mission of the organization or the chapter or the task force is being met or it's being exceeded, then you know the succession plan is working. And then also if people are, while it's not statistical, but if people are being evaluated in a favorable way, meaning whether it's performance evaluations or whether it's just the hallway conversation about, wow, that team really rocked it, right? They really met the mission. That's when you know the succession plan is working, because if that sustains itself, you know that as people move in and move out and they still are able to achieve that kind of success, then you know the plan is working.
Thank you. And I love what you guys all said. If you're uncomfortable and you have this fear, then you're in the right place. So for the final question for our audience, what is one tip that you would have the audience take away so they can begin their succession plan or even move it forward towards their exit that they're looking for?
So for me, like any good intelligence officer, again, you're spotting and assessing daily from a managerial level. You know, when you're really, like Ron said, not holding a grudge against people and you're really looking at the whole package, you'll find a lot of hidden gems that you just overlooked, right? My example is when I first came back from the field, we were putting a new platform up, and no joke, none of my branch chiefs wanted to lead this huge effort, which was going to get them in front of the director. And, you know, a lot of they were just all afraid. So I looked down into my, what we consider mid-hires, people that had um, entered on duty to the agency, but had 5 to 7 years. And they basically led this entire platform change. Now that may not sound significant, but when you knew all the players that they were working with, and the depth of knowledge that they had to jump into, that was very significant. They took a risk with me. I backed them up as a good leader. And each one of these, and no joke, they were like GS 9s and 10s, have gone in to major leadership positions throughout our field efforts. They're leading tactical efforts, and one is working in our largest cyber cell. So, you know, again, you need to look at those hidden gems. And I would also encourage open dialogue with mentees and teammates to really listen to their aspirations, because sometimes as mentors, we kind of put our stuff onto our mentees, and we really need to be open and listening to what people really do want. And then actively listen when they tell you what they don't want. As a subject matter expert in application development, when when you're a SME in something, and you're successful at it, what they immediately want you to do is what? Manage people. And there's a lot of subject matter experts that don't necessarily manage. We want to have depth in what we know. And I actively listened to these people. In fact, I had one young lady, she was our best Ruby developer in the CIA. And every year before promotion panel, she would come in and she would tell me, Roy, please tell the panel not to promote me. I want to remain doing this. This is what I love. And yet management kept trying to push her forward, and she would have been miserable. And I'm not saying she wouldn't have been successful, but I don't think that would have been her vibe, right? So she is much happier and prospering in the agency as a subject matter expert.
Thank you.
I
Jeanette?
think that's just really profound what you're saying, right? And this idea of looking to see where people end up beyond you. I've had just the amazing and very humbling ability to have placed people that have ended up at major law firms, ended up at every single one of the FANGs, leading tech companies, aerospace companies, and so forth. And occasionally somebody will ask, how does it make you feel to lose someone? And I'm like, listen, if that's where they're going, I'll do this all day long. This is what it's about, bringing smart people into a very weird niche field and helping to launch careers. So I once walked into a colleague's office and he had this sign and it said, what would you do if you knew that you could not fail? And that really stopped me in my tracks. It made me think, and it's become one of several guiding principles that I try to use every single day. Good succession planning is about imagining the impossible. It's about thinking beyond your own aspirations. So what does that look like? It isn't about what's the next step. It's about visualizing an ideal state and then working backwards to give yourself the broadest possible array of possible next steps that you can choose from and test out. We've said this before, I think it bears repeating, never ever hire in your own image, especially when you're looking for your successor. If he or she or they remind you of yourself, keep looking. When your successor achieves something that you were never able to do, maybe not even dream of, know that they stood on your shoulders to get there and be proud.
Ron, you're in a tough spot.
I know. How do you top those two things? Good God. So I guess I would say maybe just to build a little bit on what Jeanette just said. For your individual succession plan, I think the number one tip that I would say to you is ensure that you are not deceiving yourself about your abilities. And by that, I mean, it doesn't matter if you're a type A or type B person, or you're always willing to take a risk, or you're the go-getter that will be the first in line and always raise your hand and express your opinions. And people will naturally fall behind you because you are that overt driver of change or opinion. That doesn't mean you're good. Okay. Just because people follow you doesn't mean you're good. Okay. You have to ensure that you have a very clear understanding of all of your strengths, but more importantly, all of your areas of weakness. Yes, weakness, not areas of development or opportunities to grow. That's all the polite way to say weakness. You have to know what your weaknesses are. And the only way you're going to know your weaknesses is not through failure. It's by having trusted people that will tell you honestly what your weaknesses are. And that could be mentors, that could be sponsors. It may be your antagonist in the office, could be outside of the office, could be family members, it could be your spouse or significant other. It could be all of those people. And you need to listen to all of them, because collectively they may see small parts, but when you put that feedback together, that may form a trend or a larger picture that is a blind spot or a roadblock for you in your development. And to have a true succession plan, you have to be able to say, I know this area here is a major problem for me, and I need to figure out a way that I'm going to get past that, to get over it, to work through it. But just ignoring it or thinking that's not a weakness, these people don't understand me, I know I'm really good there, your succession plan is now officially broken before you've even started it. So the single tip that I have for you, and probably the thing that has served me best throughout my variety of careers, is having a trusted network that you can go to say, tell me what I'm doing wrong, not tell me what I'm doing right. And that's key.
Thank you. And we do have one question in the chat, which Jeanette did answer. I don't know, Jeanette, if you want to elaborate on that, but the question is, how do you make yourself conscious of the like me bias?
I think that's really important because we naturally gravitate to people who are like us, right? Or who reflect us in some way. So it may be the person that you disagree with the most, or the person that you almost kind of dread being assigned to work with. That's the person that you're going to learn the most from and might surprise you. You know, I work really hard to create space and to hold space for people, because not everyone thinks at lightning speed, right? Some of us need a little bit more time to craft a thoughtful answer. Not everybody has the same work style. One of the first things I say to people is, look, you're going to get weird emails from me at all hours of the day or night. I only ever expect responses sometime between, I don't know, 9:30 and 4-ish. But to be clear, AM to PM, in whatever time zone is your normal time zone. So you should just ignore all my stuff, and that's just my stream of consciousness.
Might I also recommend that if you don't know what your bias is, and if you don't think you have one, let me clear this camera, because everybody does. I think you go to Harvard EDU and there's a bias test on there, right? And it only takes 10 minutes. We did it for all of anybody that touched talent to recruit or manage talent in DDI. They had to take it. And you'd be surprised what some of your biases are. I didn't care if you were Black, white, disabled, LGBTQ. Where my blip were other Asian women. And I'm like, what? And so I wrote Harvard because this had to be wrong. And I got a long email back saying, it's because you hold them to a different standard, a much higher standard that you do everybody else. Well, okay, so what? Well, I was the person hiring for DDI. And if I didn't understand my bias, it could have really been detrimental to anybody that actually looked like me that I was interviewing, because I was not going to be equitable in how I looked at that interview or their resume or their history. So I think understanding your bias, you also have to look and be honest of what you think your bias is. It doesn't mean you're racist. It just means you prefer one thing or the other. But it also leads to groupthink. If you have too many people like you, right, you get to a decision very quickly. That is never a good thing. You need some tension in there.
And if I could add, Joanne, just one additional comment there. And it actually goes back to something Jeanette said earlier about if they're like you, keep looking. There could be occasions where you do need to find someone who shares many of the attributes that you have. And that will help the goal or the mission of the group that is being led to continue on, if it's the direction that you need to go. So just knowing that someone is different than you doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a good fit. It also has to build in, where is the organization going, or what is the purpose? How is it changing given the evolution of the need, or it could be the talent base, or it could be the goal of the organization that evolves. And so maybe the need for your successor or succession in the organization also evolves too. So I have worked for many, many different kinds of leaders over my years. And looking back on them, there are some that I thought, how did I ever get through that person? Because they weren't very friendly, they were abrasive, they were short, they didn't really ask me what I thought, they didn't invite me in, they just said, go do it. And then you went and did it, and they said, okay, great, now go do this. And then there were others that were the exact opposite, where they said, oh, tell me what you think. How would you approach this? Tell me how you're feeling. And that's great. But in the end, every leader has different styles. And it's not about style. It's about what the true link to the mission is. And is their approach meeting the needs of the mission? And that's what you have to be able to assess if you're in that role. What is the mission? How is the mission going to change? And what kind of leadership might be good for that next generation of leader? And that's what you then start looking for in your next generation in terms of a succession plan.
Thank you. And we are close to the end of time, but we do have one question that came in. So maybe we can just take a minute each to respond of, how do you combat bias? An example, hiring people like you while keeping the doors for people. Yeah, sorry, the chat kept moving. Yeah, so I know Jeanette answered on there, but Roy or Ron, if you want to just chime in on that.
I'll go first before Roy.
Yes. That's okay.
So I think the key is to have somebody else do the assessment and somebody else do the hiring. If you're worried that you don't think you'll be diverse enough or innovative enough in your thinking or unbiased enough, ask somebody else to do it. And then don't second guess them. Trust that they're going to do it the right way.
Well, Jeanette and Ron hit it on this right on the head too. Again, you have to know what your bias is, right? And constantly kind of just keep yourself in check, and it'll pop up in all other areas. I do want to add on to something that Ron and Jeanette said about having people around you to keep you in check. I have a sisterhood of warriors at the agency that we compete with each other for promotions, for key positions, right? And yet we're still like awesome friends, but we will tell each other when something is jacked up that we've done. And I'll give you an example. I've been in the field and I've never really had to do an interview at headquarters. And my girlfriend, Kathleen Nair, she is now the deputy DDI. I was interviewing and I gave one of the worst interviews ever. I mean, it was so long. As a subject matter expert, I'm going into code during the interview. And she pulled me aside and she goes, Roy, that was actually very painful to watch. And here are some things that I recommend. And, I got a little, whatever. But she was right. And I played that forward and tried to give precise and actionable feedback to anybody that screwed up in an interview. I would literally take them aside and say, hey, you may want to consider this, because I know if you're really being a good friend, it's hard to tell a friend, hey, this is where you could tighten up.
And thank you guys for being here and just sharing your insight, your wisdom. We are at the end of our session. So before we go, I'm going to unpin you guys on the spotlight so we can take a screenshot group picture. Let's see.
And Jeanette, you stole my line. I love being the dumbest person in the room. I love connecting. I love being surrounded by smart people.
All right. Okay. Sean, you ready to take it? I think he's counting. Okay, we're good? Oh, Sean, you gotta unmute yourself. There you go.
Apologize. Okay, on 3. 1, 2, 3. Got it.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you guys for being here. This concludes our session. So in the link, just hop back onto the big main room. That's where we'll have our breakout session. I also put the link to our speaker's bio on there. So if you want to have a further conversation and just kind of learn from their experience, feel free to reach out to them. All right.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Thank you
everyone.
so much,
Bye.
Joanne. Great job.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Joanne. Well done.
Thanks, everyone.
You're awesome.
Bye-bye.
Good seeing you guys.
Take
Bye.
care.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.